This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
Yeah, I'll be talking about this whole area of the cremation grounds. Of course, this weekend is on the topic of the cremation grounds and the celestial maidens. I know very little of celestial maidens. Padmaloka is going to talk more on the celestial maidens tomorrow. But today I'm going to talk a bit about the cremation grounds. I'm going to go into the whole area of the cremation grounds, what they are, I suppose, literally, but more importantly, what they are symbolically as well. So what are the cremation grounds? Well, first of all, literally, what are the cremation grounds? So in India, of course, and some of you will know this if you've been to India, it's a very different burial system from the one that we have here. In India, what you do with the body is you take it out once the period of mourning has finished. You take it out to the burial grounds, the cremation grounds. And the cremation grounds will often be by the bank of the river. And you'll sometimes see these cremation grounds, these cremation processes go through India. I've been very lucky. As Bodhi Naga said, I did work for Karna for some time, and with that work I was regularly out in India, and often you'd see in India this cremation scene, this sort of process where they lift the body high on the cremation pyre and then they bring it to the cremation ground, often on the edge of town, by the river, and there they burn the body. They cover it in ghee or parasine or whatever it might be, and there they burn the body. And the body is left to burn there, and the skeleton will be left there as well. So you'll have hundreds, thousands probably of bodies burnt in this particular area over time. And you could imagine they're particularly atmospheric areas. You know, you go into a graveyard, it's a particularly atmospheric area, isn't it? But you could imagine these cremation grounds are just full of atmosphere. Bhante Sangharakshita, the man who founded Triratna, he spent quite a number of years in India, and he used to talk about the sense of joy and celebration and energy that would often come with these cremation processes. There was a sense of release, of liberation. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in relation to death in a moment, but he said the mourning at that point was done. You'd have done the mourning and you would be really celebrating the life of the person. So you go to the cremation ground and the body would be left there, and that has, as far as I know, as it's been done in India for millennium. This was also how it was done in the days at the time of the Buddha. And the cremation grounds would be particular areas of practice then for the Buddha and his followers. His followers were encouraged to go in, sit amongst the cremation grounds. You'd see the bodies in various stages of decomposition while they were in the burial grounds. Some still reasonably fresh and uncorrupted. Some of them starting to fester and bloat. Some of them right at the point of kind of decomposition. You could imagine what it was like, crawling probably with all sorts of maggots and, all the bodily fluid coming out. And really right there, the reality of death right in front of you. And the Buddha's followers would be encouraged to go and sit in these cremation grounds and take in the reality of, death, sort of generally you could say, but also their own death. The fact that we all one day will die, and we all one day will take on this form. Our bodies will take on this form, decomposing like a corpse. And this became part of a practice of the Buddha's followers, where you bring to mind the stages of the decomposition of a corpse. 10 of them in total, I'm told. I don't do this practice. I wouldn't necessarily advise it. It was sort of for pretty strong temperaments if you were to take on this practice. But the Buddha's followers, that's what they do. They'd reflect on the stages of the decomposition of the corpse, and of course their own death as well. Really what they're reflecting on in that is the fact that they too will die. They too will one day end up like that. And it's still practiced today in the Buddhist tradition, still widely practiced today in the Buddhist tradition. It's also particularly associated, the cremation grounds, particularly also associated with Padmasambhava. Padmasambhava was the great teacher, the great yogi who took the teachings from India to Tibet sometime around, they think, around the 7th or 8th century. And he's particularly associated with the cremation grounds, with sitting in the cremation grounds and, I suppose, meditating on death, but also communing with the forces of energy, of liberation that were inherent within the cremation grounds. And these were particularly embodied, personified in the form of the celestial maidens and the yoginis. Padmavajra will have more to say on that tomorrow. But so particularly associated with Padmavandra or with Padmasambhava, these particular grounds. So they have a strong resonance in the Buddhist tradition. The cremation ground has a strong resonance. And I think that resonance is one, as I was saying, one of potential, one of liberation, one of challenge, one, in fact, of thrill, of joy. And I think that's probably the first thing just to say about death. Let's just think about our death literally for a moment, the fact that we're all going to die. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably think of that fact quite morosely. I think in the Western tradition, the way that we generally associate with death is the Grim Reaper, isn't it? You sort of think of death, you think of kind of the Grim Reaper, you think in a sense of extinction, of nullification, of blank, of voidness. That's the way we sort of tend to think, voidness in the worst sense. That's the way we tend to think of our own deaths. I think that view of my death is still very much, even though I don't necessarily consciously think of it that way, that's the emotional relationship I have with my death. Sort of everything that I hold dear, me in all senses, will just be annihilated. You get this in our poetry as well, don't you? It's typical of say, the poetry that you get in, take for example somebody like Larkin, a genius, a poetic genius, one of my favourite poets of all time. But very much viewed that, death in that way. He talks about death as total emptiness forever, the sure extinction that we travel to and shall be lost in always, not to be here, not to be anywhere, and soon nothing more terrible, nothing more true. So that's how Larkin thinks of death, and I think that's probably in the zeitgeist, that's probably our relationship with death. I was in Cornwall last week walking with my brother Pete. We went sort of camping and hiking down around the coast, and it'll be the last time probably myself and my brother get an opportunity to do that. He's got kids on the way, or hopefully he has a kid on the way, and all being well. And, he'll go on to the next phase of his life now. My other younger brother, Nick, also has a kid on the way. So he'll go on to the next phase. The two of them will go on to the next phase of their life. And I was very, very aware of my time walking with my brother that this would probably be the last opportunity that we got to do something like that. And becoming very, very aware of the impermanence, the transitoriness of the connection with my brother, who I hold very dearly. I love very, very much, both of my younger brothers. And of course, that is a connection that is subject to time, that is subject to impermanence. It will not be there forever. And I always get this feeling when I'm with my brothers, I get this very, very strong sense of time passing. Maybe you get this as well with siblings, where you've grown up together, you've known each other from year naught. And with each year, you get a little bit older, and we look at the photos, and sometimes it can be some time between seeing my brothers, and I'll go and I'll see them, and they've got a little bit older, and that means I've got a little bit older as well. You get this for friends sometimes, don't you, where you've spent some time apart and you meet again, you go, God, you've really got old. Therefore, I've got really old as well. But I always get a very, very strong sense, and a very, very strong sadness comes up with that as well. My younger brother Nick, at one point in university, we all shared this room together in my dad's apartment in Dublin. We were in one room. It was a total disaster. I mean, three young men, all two in a bunk bed, one on the floor. It was just not pretty. We used to have this montage up on the wall that my dad had made of when we were younger. We were all kids. We were all, in the ages of about 4, 6, 8, that sort of territory. We were reasonably close in age. And Nick, who is just about the most stoic man you will ever come across, I mean, you have to wrench an emotion out of him. Like, you can sometimes manage it after 12 pints of lager, but that's about it. You have to really squeeze an emotion out of him. And he used to look at these montages, and one day he just said, "God, I really can't look at, I can't look at those photos." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Why not?" And he said, "I don't know. They make me really sad." And for him, that was quite a significant thing to say. Now, the photos were joyous, but of course what he was seeing was the fact of our own impermanence. The fact that we are now 3 men, and we were 3 children. We will one day, hopefully, be 3 old men together, hopefully. And then, of course, one day we won't be at all. And, of course, that is reflected within this montage of us being as kids. And so I think that is somehow how we relate to death. Now, of course, that is an aspect of death, but it is only one aspect of death. And I think that is the important thing to emphasize. That if in me, in my relating to death in that way of loss, of mournfulness, of gravity, of sorrow, okay, that's an aspect of death. But I don't think that's the aspect of death that the Buddha is really pointing at. That's not what he's pointing at when he gets us to reflect on death. That's not what the tradition is. It's not getting you to dwell in sorrow in any sense. Yes, there is an aspect of suffering to death, but really I think what the Buddha is pointing to is the sense of potential, the sense of life, of energy, of liberation that is sort of inherent in the idea of death as well. You get this very much in, say, for example, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where the death process, the process of dying, is one of release. And of course you get this massive sort of electric light show in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, don't you? When you die, the consciousness is said to be totally liberated and goes into the bardo, which is a moment of very, very strong potency, very, very strong potential, where anything can change, where really it's all up for grabs. Released from the sort of binds of the body, the consciousness is free to sort of move, to go in a different direction. And I think this is really the aspect of death that the Buddha is pointing at, this idea, this sense of thrill even, of potential. There is, even within the Western tradition, an idea, a sense of that, I think, within our own poetry. So say, for example, you have the poetry of Whitman. Now, Whitman takes a very, very different idea of death than Larkin. And I'll read you a little bit about what Whitman has to say. He says, "All waits undreamed of in that region, that inaccessible land, till when the ties loosen, all but the ties eternal, time and space, nor darkness, gravitation, sense, nor any bounds bounding us. Then we burst forth, we float in time and space, O soul, prepared for them, equal, equipped at last, O joy, O fruit of all, them to fulfill, O soul." So you can see the difference of emphasis there, where Larkin has really emphasized the ending. In a sense, what Whitman is doing is emphasizing the beginning. And Whitman talks about this in his poetry, where he says death isn't something that waits at the end of life, that sort of Grim Reaper image, where death sort of just sits there binding its time until life has fallen away, and then descends, swoops to sort of claim what's its. In Whitman's poetry, it's much more that it goes hand in hand with life. Death goes hand in hand with life. In fact, the way that he talks about it is that death pushes life forward. It renews life in a sense. It's almost an act of sort of creative destruction. You get this in the Hindu tradition as well, where you have Shiva. Shiva is the great destroyer. And what that's pointing at is actually not destruction in a sort of negative sense, but the recreation of life, the pushing forward of life. I mean, what a remarkable thing it must be to die when you think about it. That must be in some ways, such a thrilling experience. You go into it by yourself, completely alone, and what an adventure. in a certain sense. Of course, all of this is to think of death not as the end, and the Buddhist tradition really emphasizes that death isn't the end, that there is something more after that. There is rebirth, there is the potential, there is rebirth, there is a new beginning. Consciousness alights a new consciousness which starts the whole process of life again. So that's the literal death, of course, that we will all experience, and that's what's been pointed to with the cremation ground. But there's also this symbolic aspect of death, or what you could think of as spiritual death. Now, what spiritual death is I suppose a sense of the death of everything that we it's the death of self-view. Self-view in the sense of thinking of ourselves as a distinct and separate entity from both our experience, the world around us, and the people around us as well. So spiritual death is that process whereby everything that is all our self-views, all the sort of holding ourselves sort of, or the fascination with self, you could say, the clinging to self, that all gives way, that all dies. So that's, say, for example, all the, if you want to think of this symbolically, in a way that maybe we can relate to more, the image of ourselves that we look to portray to ourselves and to other people. So the very positive image of ourselves that we often look to sell to ourselves and other people. That image of somebody who could never do harm, could never behave in an evil manner, could never behave hatefully, could never behave violently. That sense of ourself dies. We recognize that we are part of conditions. And of course, the 20th century, when you look at the 20th century, it's riddled with cases of people just like you and me who were put into certain conditions and then behave brutally towards each other. Those people are not unique in any sense. They don't have uniquely evil minds. They're not sort of an aberration of history or of humanness in any sense. They're people like you and me, and put into certain conditions of chaos or the breakdown of society, behave evilly and with brutality towards others. I can only be very, very thankful that I've been born into such a time of prosperity, security, peace, all of those things, where I don't have to fight for food, for example, or I'm not ideologically possessed, because that's the sort of zeitgeist around me. I'm very, very lucky for that, because I know full well that I would not behave well. I have absolutely no doubt about that. So with spiritual death, that view of ourselves as being a nice person, as being fundamentally a meek person, dies. Similarly, any view of ourselves as being inherently bad also dies. Equally conceited to view of ourselves as just always bad, as bad people. Equally contrived. There's so much within us that can be positive if just given the opportunity to arise. Bhante Sangharakshita used to say he was much, much more interested in what we bury in us that's positive than what we bury that's negative. Often we're sort of interested in the shadow, in the dirt, aren't we? And and of course when Freud started talking about the shadow, he particularly was talking about sex. And anything that we bury sexually, we want to know about that. Where are we burying sort of our sexual drives or our, our trauma or whatever it might be. But Bhante was really concerned to say, well, what is it you bury? What is it you deny that's healthy, that's positive, that's good? Because there'll be so much of that as well. And so often when we start to meditate, we realize, when we start to practice, when we start to engage in friendship, that there's so much of positivity in us that we look to deny. Maybe because, I don't know, we couldn't express it when we were younger because it would be thrown back at us or mocked or taken advantage of, whatever it might be, but we've learned not to express it. Very, very important that we learn to express that positivity within us as well, those healthy drives within us as well. Bhante used to say that, Sangharakshita used to say that actually if you didn't express those positive drives within us, actually what would happen is they would turn negative. They'd come back in and they'd sort of, they'd turn resentful, they'd turn destructive, they turn back in and turn destructive. So very, very important that we express those. So with spiritual death, we drop any sense of ourselves, any fixed idea of ourselves as this sort of person. I'm this sort of person in a good way, I'm this sort of person in a bad way. We drop any idea of it and we just start to notice what it is we are. That's on a sort of more relatable level. And of course, on a bigger level, spiritual death is really the death of any sort of gripping whatsoever, any holding whatsoever. We've not much that I can say about that, I'm afraid. But it's a very, very majestic and magical vision, spiritual death, and really the greatest sense, because what it gives rise to is spiritual rebirth. And with spiritual rebirth comes, well, in a sense, our potential as Buddhas, our potential as enlightened human beings, which is our birthright as human beings. And I think we'll hear a bit more about that with the Celestial Maidens potentially tomorrow. I don't want to put words in Pat Fetcher's mouth. So that's spiritual death. So spiritual death often comes from the cremation grounds. If the cremation grounds is associated with death literally, it's also associated with spiritual death or symbolic death, you could say. So with the cremation grounds comes death and comes spiritual death. Now, one way that we can think of the cremation grounds in our day-to-day life, because of course I don't know about you, but I don't have very much access to a literal cremation grounds. I can't go and sit amongst corpses. I think it is a very good idea, actually, very, very good. I think that funerals within the Triratna movement, often you get an open casket so that you can really just look to sit with death for a moment. Bhante Sangharakshita died not that long ago, and a couple of years ago now, I think, and it was just such a privilege to go and sit with his body in Adhisthana, and just, for me to take in my teacher, but also just to contemplate the reality of his death and death generally. But I think it's very, very good that we have that. But of course, we don't have a huge amount of access to that, and we certainly do not have access to cremation grounds. So one of the ways that we can think of the cremation grounds more in our day-to-day life is the crucial situation. So what is the crucial situation? Well, the crucial situation is the situation that demands growth of you. In a sense, it's the situation that you cannot get through as you currently are. You won't survive it as you currently are. It's going to insist, if you're going to make it through it, on you growing. In a sense, it's going to break you. It's going to break you in the most positive sort of sense. It's going to demand of you that something comes from within your potential to meet the situation, to rise to the situation that has not been there before. So this is the way that you can think of the crucial situation. You could imagine it as a task that's just too big for us. The crucial situation is a task that's just too big for us as we're currently formed. And we have to break down and reform in a more positive sense, in a more healthy way, in a more powerful sense, a more strong sense, a more courageous sense, if we're going to get through it. So you could think of this, say for example, I think one of the images for this, one of the very good stories for this, or images for this, is the story of Avalokiteshvara. Avalokiteshvara, you'll see him somewhere here in the shrine. I can't quite, it's over, where is he? He's up back there, maybe we can't, oh yes, of course, so it's the two there. Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva, particularly associated with compassion in the Tibetan tradition. And the story of Avalokiteshvara is before, when he was just a Bodhisattva, but before he was the sort of 1,000-armed embodiment that we know of him today. he was reflecting on the suffering of the people of the land of Tibet. And he was so moved by this suffering that he took a vow. And he took a vow to meditate to save all sentient living beings in the land of Tibet, to deliver them from suffering, to deliver them to enlightenment. And he said, if I get distracted for one moment from this task of delivering sentient beings, may I shatter into 1,000 pieces. So Avalokiteshvara goes off and he meditates, looking to deliver sentient beings from samsara, from this realm of suffering. And he meditates and he meditates. We can only assume for eons, for kalpas, for hundreds, millions of years. And he decides to have a little look and see how well he's going. We do this. We know we're meditating really well. We decide to have a little peek at our watch just to see how long is left. But anyway, Avalokiteshvara decides to have a look and see how he's getting on. And he sees that at that moment that he has not delivered but a few sentient beings from suffering. And each time that he delivers a sentient being from suffering, more fall into the realms of samsara. So in a sense that he sees that his task, the thing that he's put up to himself, is impossible in a certain sense. And at that moment, distracted as he has become from his task, he breaks into 1,000 pieces. And breaking into 1,000 pieces, he calls on Amitabha. He calls out for help. He says, Amitabha, please help me. And Amitabha, moved by Avalokiteshvara's plight, reforms him again as the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara that we now know, as the Bodhisattva of compassion, particularly venerated in Tibet. But it's interesting, the story, isn't it? Because the story is fundamentally one of failure. Avalokiteshvara, in a sense, has failed at what he set himself out to do. He couldn't possibly do it in the form that he was. He needed to be broken, in a sense, and he needed to be reformed. He needed to be put back together, and he needed to ask for help to do that. You probably have sort of examples in your own lives, but I mean, I have a particularly painful one that I can relate. When I first came to London, when I was I must have been about 27 or so, I worked for Karana, as Bodhinaga was saying. I worked for Karana, and I was a fundraiser. Now, I was the least suitable fundraiser you could possibly imagine. I mean, like, introverted beyond belief, neurotic, grumpy, withdrawn, lacking confidence, overly apologetic. I mean, everything that you wouldn't want in a fundraiser, I was as a fundraiser. So I'd get on the phone, and I'd dial a number half-heartedly. Oh, hey, how's it going? Can I have some money? No, all right, okay, sorry for bothering you. Day after day. Can I have some money? No, all right, okay, sorry for bothering you. And I was in the cremation grounds. There was absolutely no way, because I'd been given a stupendous amount of money to raise, 200 grand or something like that. And I was at a big fat zero for most of the time. Very, very 50-50 as to whether I was going to keep my job. There's some some of you will know, you'll have met me at that time. It was really, really 50-50 as to whether I was going to keep my job. And I was in the cremation grounds. I was in the crucial situation. There was absolutely no way I was going to get any further with what I needed to do as the person that I was. In a sense, I needed to be broken. I needed to break apart, and I needed to come back together in a more healthy, positive way. And over time, I did that. It really, really was a very difficult situation. I was getting panic attacks. I was wide awake at night. I lost a whole bucket of weight, even though I was eating like a horse all around me. I'd go into the doctors. I'd say there's something wrong. Doctor would say there's nothing wrong. I'd say there's something wrong. Doctor would say there's nothing wrong. Back and forth. And eventually I broke. Not broke. I didn't have a breakdown or anything, don't worry. But in the sense that this thing that I was just trying to hold together, this image of myself, this form that I was clinging to so strongly, just had to break apart. And what needed to come through was somebody that was actually up to the task of raising money, of taking responsibility and raising money. Taking responsibility for myself, taking responsibility for the job that I had, taking responsibility and raising money. And what happened was it happened, but it was the situation that I was in that needed to break me. So the crucial situation, the cremation grounds, are the ones that demand of something more from you than you're able to deliver in your current form, and they're very, very, very good. Put yourself in them as much as you possibly can. As uncomfortable as it is, they are very, very, very good. They are the most objective and concrete way of bringing about growth, I think. In a sense, you could describe Padmaloka as a cremation grounds in that, actually. Some of you here will know that, some of you here will be training for ordination. There's a talk, there's a question and answers tomorrow about thinking about ordination, if you are thinking about asking. But in a sense, Padmaloka is a cremation grounds, and ordination is a cremation ground in that sense as well. It will demand more of you than you're able to give in your current form. If you're training for ordination, to be ordained will demand more of you than you're able to give in your current form. It will demand, in a sense, that you break and that you be reformed in a healthier, stronger, more powerful, more virile, more positive, more loving, more friendly, more generous, more patient way. And so, in a sense, you could think of Padmaloka as a cremation ground, as the crucial situation. I still feel it. When I come to Padmaloka, I walk in the gates and I feel myself being brought up against the most recalcitrant, stubborn aspects of myself that just sometimes, just feel like they refuse to be reformed. I still feel it now. It's very, very strong, that sense, Padmaloka as a crucial situation, as a cremation ground. So what you need to do, I think, and I want to say a little bit now more about what you need to do for the crucial situation for the cremation grounds to work. Because, of course, you could take yourself into a situation that demands more of you than you can possibly give, and of course it might not work. I have that. I'm put up to a task, I fail, and that's it. It's not done very much for me. I've not benefited from it. Other people haven't benefited from it. So the cremation grounds need some things for it to work. And the first thing, I think that's very, very important for a cremation ground to be potent, to have its effect, is to take responsibility. Now, taking responsibility, that is in the objective sense of taking responsibility for the concrete aspects of your life, and taking responsibility even for the aspects of other people's lives, the lives of people around you as well, especially those that are dependent on you. Be those friends or family or colleagues or whatever it might be, taking responsibility for yourself and for them as much as you possibly can, but particularly taking responsibility for how you respond, how you respond in situations. Taking responsibility for how you respond, how your mind is. I suppose what you're taking responsibility for is your mind. With that, the spiritual life, if you can take responsibility, the spiritual life just can be the most incredible thing when it comes to transformation. I mean, I just get amazed at looking at people and seeing from one year to the next that how much somebody can grow when they commit themselves to the spiritual life. I look at myself, who was a complete, can only be described as a mess in my early 20s. A sheer miracle that I'm anywhere near close to a responsible adult at this point, only through the Dharma. I see it with other people as well. I've been in Mitra study groups with people where all of a sudden I'll look at them one day and I'll go, wow, you've really changed. It's just become manifest all of a sudden. And that's because they've taken responsibility. If you take responsibility, the Dharma life, the Buddhist teachings, Sangharakshita's teachings will be magical. They'll be incredibly transformative. If you don't take responsibility, they won't work. And I have seen this as well, I'm afraid. People that have been around the movement practicing for decade on decade, and they've made absolutely no growth or very little growth whatsoever because they don't take responsibility. That does happen as well. So taking responsibility, it can be remarkable the progress you'll make with it and without it very, very little. So I think responsibility is right at the heart of Buddhism. Taking responsibility is right at the heart of Buddhism. And you get this, say, for example, in the opening stanzas of the Dhammapada. The Dhammapada is a book of aphorisms, you could say, of the Buddha. So short aphorisms, essential pithy teachings of the Buddha. And you get it right at the heart of that, I think, this need to take responsibility if we're going to grow. So the opening two stanzas of the Dhammapada are: experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. Now, you might wonder, what's that got to do with responsibility? But what's that saying? I think those opening stanzas of the Dhammapada is saying is that mind, your mind, my mind, is the most important thing, is the central thing. For Buddhism, mind is the central thing. You could almost define Buddhism that way. You could say Buddhism is defined by the idea that mind is the central thing. Arguable if you wanted to define it that way, if you could define Buddhism at all. But you could say it's the teaching that puts mind right at the heart. So what that means is that our experience, my experience, is fundamentally down to my mind. Not what happens to me. Not how my career goes. Not how my love life goes, terribly, as it happens. Not how my health goes. Not on the basis of my recent 5k running time. Not on the basis of anything like that. It's my mind. That is the most fundamental thing to my experience of my life, is my mind. If I have a pure mind, if I have a loving mind, a friendly mind, a courageous mind, my experience will be positive. If I have a negative mind, an ugly mind, a craving mind, selfish, hateful, grasping, then my experience will be negative, irrespective of what happens to me. You see this so often, don't you, for example, that you get those stories of lottery winners. They win an absolute small fortune. And you think, oh God, they're made. Their lives are transformed. And in one sense, their lives are transformed. But a year later, and it often, apparently there's the studies to back this up. A year later, they feel exactly as they did before they won the lottery. In fact, they often can be in a lot worse of a place because maybe the negativity of their mind, which has been somewhat curtailed and limited by a limited income, has now been just set free, and they can do whatever they like with it. And they're often in a very, very bad place, and predominantly, apparently, not in a better place than they were before they won the lottery. So this life-changing event, well, they still have your mind. You still have your mind. It's still, your experience is still produced by that. Similarly, for example, you also see people that go through life-changing accidents. They have a really significant car crash or whatever it might be. Maybe they're in a wheelchair. Maybe their lives are completely affected forever by that in terms of their physical ability to sort of move around, work, all of those things. And yet they still seem to have the same quality of experience that they did before the accident, once mind reasserts itself. So mind is the most important thing, not what happens to us externally, which is usually the area that we most concentrate on, isn't it? It's not our mind, but the externals of our life. So Buddhism is saying is that you take responsibility for your mind. Because mind is the most important thing. And it's interesting that those two stanzas come at the very, very start of the Dhammapada, putting the centrality of mind in there, but also, I think, the centrality of responsibility. So what that means is a rejection of blame and resentment. One of the ways that we don't take responsibility is we're blaming and we're resentful. So we know how it goes, doesn't it? We sort of get stuck on our misfortune, and there's somebody to blame for that. There's somebody to blame on our misfortune. It's either Boris Johnson or Mummy or our boss or whoever it might be. Sometimes, people join the order and all of a sudden it's the order is to blame. So it's a very, very common thing, isn't it, to blame, to want to put the responsibility for our lives and our mind onto somebody else. But I think what the Buddha is saying is that, of course, that just gets away from our own responsibility. And again, the following two stanzas from the first, so the third and fourth stanza, again are pointing at this need to avoid blame and to stay with responsibility. So these stanzas say, those who entertain such thoughts as he abused me, he beat me, he conquered me, he robbed me, will not still their hatred. Those who do not entertain such thoughts as he abused me, he beat me, he conquered me, he robbed me, will still their hatred. So very interesting, isn't it, that you've got these two stanzas straight after the ones sort of holding up the centrality of mind, holding up the idea of avoiding blame. So I think these first four stanzas actually of the Dhammapada are really about radically taking responsibility, not putting our misfortune out onto anybody else, but recognizing the centrality of our own mind and the need not to blame others. So I think what that says is that the spiritual life starts with taking responsibility for ourselves. That is the opening act, in a sense, of the spiritual life. It's to go, actually, do you know what? It's only me that's going to be able to help me. It's only me. I can't keep on putting the blame out on my parents or my job or the economy or my wife or my whoever it might be. It's only me that can help me here. You get this. I think it's possibly part of the sort of cultural zeitgeist. Nietzsche used to talk about resentment as being sort of like completely interwoven into Western thinking. Nietzsche thought of it as the morality of the weak, actually. He described resentment as the morality of the weak. And Buddhism does not believe weakness to be a virtue. So we don't believe resentment to be a virtue either. But very, very easy, and I think it's right in the sort of the fabric of Western thinking, to be resentful of those that have more than us, to assume that they've done it by foul means, by crookery, and we get resentful. We want to pull them down. But I think Nietzsche was really onto something when he described that as the morality of the weak. We really want to avoid that, I think. I've been thinking recently, there's a particular Tibetan view of karma. Now, of course, the Tibetan sort of teaching on karma slightly came out of the Hindu teaching, but it views karma in a different way, a slightly different way than we do here in Triratna, which is that in some Tibetan schools of thinking, everything that happens to you is a result of something that you've done in the past. Now, Bhante never particularly didn't agree with this interpretation of karma. But in some Tibetan schools of thinking, you think of everything that happens to you, either positive or negative, as a result of something you've done in the past. I'm starting to have some sympathy for the view, because what it does, I think, is a radical rejection of resentment and blame. You just think, okay, well, I'll take responsibility for that. You're going along one day and you fall into a hole and you break your leg. All right, it must have been something I've done in the past. Now, Bhante, really just to emphasize, did not think that was the teaching of the Buddha, but I'm starting to have some sympathy for it, because you can, at least on that basis, not put it out onto blame onto somebody else. Now, of course, what Bhante was saying about that teaching is that actually there are lots of different forms of conditionality, and you couldn't possibly say that it was necessarily something that you've done in terms of ethics that's determined something like falling in a hole and breaking your leg. The Buddha wouldn't have said that. What Bhante did say actually is your experience of that happening was dependent on what you've done with your mind so far. You could say your karma so far. So if, say, for example, you've got a lot of positive karma vipaka, a lot of positive, healthy, ethical action in the past, your experience of falling into a hole and breaking your leg will be very, very different from somebody who doesn't have that. So even though Bhante was saying that you can't possibly say that something negative happens in your life and it's down to something unskillful you've done in the past, your experience of it will still be down to your ethical life, your choices of mind that have come up to that period. So yeah, we put blame, we blame and resent people. And I'll just one other thing before we finish up, in ways that we suppose drop our responsibility, and that is we give up. So we avoid responsibility through giving up. We come to the crucial situation, and it gets difficult, doesn't it? That is the cremation grounds. The crucial situation is hard because we start to come up against ourselves. The crucial situation is only that the cremation grounds are only the cremation grounds when we start to come up against ourselves. Our old habits, those forces of stasis in us that want to keep us the way that we are, the way that we've always done things. And it's very, very hard to change them, or the experience of changing them is very, very uncomfortable. In a sense, they're quite they're quite strong habits that we come up against when we come onto the cremation grounds. Everything that holds us back, all that negativity, they're quite strong habits. In fact, I don't think they're particularly deep habits. I had this when I was on my ordination course in 2017. My Trinara was there. I had this realization that the grumpiness that I used to get myself into consistently was just a bit like picking my nose. I could just drop it. It was just a habit. And it'd been a bit like I've been going around picking my nose for 30 odd years. It was a very, very strong habit, but all I really needed to do was drop it. Sometimes the way that we can talk about our negativity, we reinforce this idea to ourselves that it's impossible to drop. And we say they're very, very deep samskaras. Goes right back to my childhood. It's right back to my parents. It's right back to my brothers and sisters, whatever it might be. I think actually most of the habits that we have, the negative habits, are just a bit like picking our nose. You just got to stop it. Yeah, okay, it might be hard if you've been doing it for a long time, but just stop it. It's just a bad habit. Now, of course, it's as easy and not as easy as that. In a sense, it's as easy as that. In a sense, it's very, very difficult to drop the habits that we have a lifetime of. But it really did seem that way to me in Gukiloka at the time. I thought, God, my grumpiness is just a habit, and I could just as easily drop it as keep on running with it. It'd be much, much better for me just to drop it. So I think we've really got to be aware of how we talk to ourselves when we think of our own sort of those negative things that hold us back. Sometimes you get this, even in the order, for example. Sometimes, when people come up for ordination, we start to talk about, what are the things that people need to change? What are their sort of difficult aspects that will need to be worked on? And sometimes you get this terrible way of talking about it, where people will start talking about structural issues. And we say, oh, that issue with them, this particular issue is structural. And my skin crawls when I hear that. I don't think I've ever seen a structural issue, in the sense of a structural issue as something that can't be changed with somebody if they put their mind to it. You see it all the time. I've seen it all the time. Well, this person has this particular structural issue. A year later, after a little bit of work, it's transformed. It's not there anymore, or it's significantly changed. You get this stuff with I'm probably a little bit on the spectrum. I would say myself a touch on the spectrum. Not quite, treatable, but a touch on the spectrum. A little sprinkling of Asperger's in there or something like that. I could have said to myself years ago, oh, well, that's just structural. I can't do anything about that. My difficulty socializing in large groups of people, well, that's just structural. No, absolute nonsense. Give it some consciousness, give it awareness, develop friendships, meditate, bring metta to mind, follow the teachings, and engage in work, in positive, healthy work. Do all the things that's been handed down to us, and those aspects of us will transform. But don't give up. That's the really important thing. When you give up, what you do in a sense is you deny your potential. And sometimes this is the problem, is that we give up because we don't know our own potential. What the Buddha is saying to us is that our potential is that of Buddhas. Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, that is open to you, that is your birthright as a human being. If you box yourself into a particular shape and you say, oh, this is me, and if when the going gets tough, I'm just going to walk out on myself, well, you've given up because you don't know your own potential. Time and time again, I see it. In a sense, the majesty of the Dharma's of the Buddha's teachings, and the ability to transform people into healthy, beautiful, in a sense, human beings that have all the qualities of the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. So we walk out on ourselves when we give up, and of course we avoid responsibility. So I'll leave it at that. Don't give up on yourself. Put yourself into the crucial situation, into the cremation grounds. Yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it calls for courage, for determination. But it's so much more rewarding than carrying around those old habits year after year after year. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very
much. We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.